All right, 7 and 8, we're back for parts 4, 5, and 6 of Chapter 1, Johnny Tremain by Esther Forbes. My book is on page 16, section 4. The sun stood directly overhead, pressing its heat down upon the town as though it held an enormous brass basin. There was not wind enough to take a catboat from Hancock's Wharf to Noddle Island. In the Latham shop, windows and doors were left open to catch what breeze might come up the wharf, but there wasn't any breeze. Old Mr. Latham had worked well in the morning. He said if Johnny could do the handles, he himself could get the basin done in time. But after dinner he had gone down to the old willow behind the coal house, put a basket over his head, and gone asleep. Dove and Dusty had therefore left to go swimming. Johnny was making out of wax the exact replica of the pitcher handle, only enlarging it. He tried again and again, never quite satisfied with his work, but confident that he could do it. It was long past dinner hour when he crossed the entry into the kitchen. The fire was out, the table cleared except for his place. Scylla had evidently been left to wait on him whenever he felt like eating. The success of Mr. Hancock's order was to be dependent on him. No one would scold him today because he chose to be an hour late. Johnny took his seat, and Scylla put down the slate she had been drawing on. She gave him a piece of cold meat pie and a flat loaf of rye bread, dried apples, and ran down cellar to fetch him a flagon of cold ale. He drank the ale and then more leisurely began on the pie. With hardly a word, Scylla went back to the settle where Azana was sprawled and picked up her slate. She drew very well. It would be just about nothing, Johnny thought, to teach that girl to write. She's doing it for you, Johnny, Azana said at last. What are you doing for me, Syl? She's designing you a beautiful mark so when you're man-grown and master-smith, you can stamp your silver with it. I've 5 more years to go, no matter how good my work may be. I have to mark it with your grandpa's old pellets and elves, Johnny's forgotten morning prayers, and all those wonderful humble people, said Scylla. Look, I've got your J and T, sort of entwined. Too hard to read. Then, too, he could not imagine why he came out with this secret. When I'm Master Smith, I'm going to use all 3 of my initials. All 3? Johnny L.T. Neither of the girls had heard of a poor working boy with 3 names. You're not making up? Scylla asked, almost respectfully. I've heard tell of folk with 3 names, but I never saw one before. Look at me, my girl. He got up to go back to the shop. Wait, Johnny, what is the middle name? It begins with L. As far as you're concerned, it ends with L too. I'll bet it's something so awful you are ashamed of it, like ladybug or leapfrog. I'll bet it's lamentable. Johnny grinned, untempted by her insults. In the shop it was so hot he could not handle the wax. The solitude in which he worked depressed him a little. For the first time he was afraid he could not get the handles right. All the shops had stopped work because of the heat. He could hear the other boys running and splashing, diving off the wharf into the cold water. He locked the shop. Now even Mr. Latham would have to ask him if he wanted to get in, and he ran off to swim. Later, after sunset, he could get on with the model, even if he had to work by lamplight. When at last he blew out his lamp, Johnny had made an exact replica of the winged woman, only larger. He looked at it and knew that it was not, for some reason, quite right. Instead of going up to the attic to sleep, he crossed into the kitchen and got an old mattress. The clock struck midnight, and he was asleep. He woke, and it was still dark night. Someone was in the room with him, and he thought of thieves. Who's there? Yelled Johnny roughly. It's me, Johnny. I wasn't going to wake you up if you were already asleep, but... What's wrong, Scylla? Johnny, it's Azana. She's sick again. What does her mother say? Scylla began to cry. I don't want to tell her. She'll just say, poor baby wasn't worth raising. Johnny was tired. At the moment he had a sneaking sympathy for Mrs. Latham's point of view. What seems to be wrong? She's so hot. She says if she can't get a breath of air, she'll throw up. This was a very old but dire threat. There might be a little down at the end of the wharf. Fetch her down. Seemed it was always like this. Whenever things went wrong and he was tired, Scylla was after him to help her nurse Azana. Nevertheless, he carried her in his thin, strong arms. She was a tiny child for 8. The whitey gold hair that he secretly admired so much got into his mouth, and he wished she was bald. Azana giggled. On one side of the deserted wharf were warehouses, and on the other were ships. Not a person was abroad except themselves. The child grew heavier and heavier. Want to walk now, Azana? You'd be cooler walking. I want to ride. Well, just so you are satisfied. Johnny, said Scylla crossly, are you being sarcastic to baby? Yes. How do you feel, dear? I feel like I'm going to throw up. Oh, you get down then, said Johnny. That settles it. But he carried her to the very end of the wharf. Suddenly, he felt cool fingers of air lifting the wet, fair hair on his forehead. The perspiration under his arms, dripping down his chest, evaporated, and the prickly sensation was delightful. Azana cried, the wind, blow, wind, blow. It did not blow, but flowed over them and cooled them. The 3 sat in a row, their feet dangling over the water below. They sat well apart at first, with arms outstretched, soaking themselves in the freshness of the sea air. For a long time they sat and said nothing. Then Azana put her head to Scylla's lap. Scylla leaned against Johnny. The 2 girls were almost asleep, but Johnny was wide awake. Johnny, murmured Azana, tell us a story? I don't know any. Johnny, said Scylla, tell us the story of your middle name. It isn't a story, it's just a fact. Well, what is it? Although by daytime, and if Scylla had teased him, he never would have told, the darkness of the night, the remoteness of the place where they sat, an affection he felt for the girls, and they for him, made everything seem different. After a long pause, he said, It's Leet. So you are really John Leet Tremain. No, my baptized Bible name is Jonathan. I've always been called Johnny. That's the way my papers were made out to your grandpa. I'm Jonathan Leet Tremain. Why, that's just like Merchant Leet. Just like. You don't suppose you are related? I do suppose, but I don't know. Leet's not a common name, and we are both Jonathan. Of course I've thought about it, some. When I see him rolling around in his coach, strutting about with his laces and gold-headed canes, but I don't aim ever to think too much about it. Azana was almost asleep. Tell more, Johnny, she murmured. Merchant Leet is so very rich. How rich? Like Mr. Hancock? Not quite. Almost. He's so rich, gold and silver are like dust to him. You mean the Leet mansion? Mrs. Leet sweeps up gold and silver in a dustpan? Mrs. Leet doesn't sweep, you silly. Not with her own fair hands. For one thing, she's dead. And for another, if she weren't, she'd just snap her fingers and the maids would come running. In frilly starched caps. They'd curtsy and squeak, yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. And if it pleased you, ma'am. Then Mrs. Leet would go, say, you dirty sluts, look at the gold dust under the bed. I could write my name in the silver dust on the mirror over that mantel. Fetch your mops and rags, you bow-legged, cross-eyed, chattering monkeys. Diamonds, too. To clean up diamonds, they'd need brooms. Oh, Johnny, tell more. Once the rubies spilled in the cook, a monstrous fine woman. I've seen her. Thought they were currants. She put them in a fruitcake, and Mr. Leet broke a front tooth from one. A fact, Johnny? Well, it's a fact that Mr. Leet got a broken front tooth. I saw it as I stood watching him. Scylla said, "You watch him much?" He answered a little miserably, "It's just like I can't help it. I don't mean ever to think of him." Azana murmured, "What do they do with their pearls?" "They drink their pearls." "What?" "Like a queen of Egypt, my mother told me of before she died. She drank her pearls in vinegar, just to show off. That Lavinia Leete is always showing off, too." Azana was asleep. "You never speak of your mother, Johnny. She hadn't been dead more'n a few weeks when you first came here. You never talked about her at all. Was that because you liked her so much, or not at all?" There was a long pause. "Liked her so much," he said at last. "We had been living at Townsend, Maine. She got a living for us both by sewing. But when she knew she had to die, she had death inside of her and she knew it. She wanted me taught skilled work, and all I wanted to do was be a silversmith. That's why we came to Boston, so as to get me a proper master. She could still sew, but she coughed all the time. Even when she was so weak she could hardly hold a needle, she kept on and on, teaching me reading and writing and all that. She was determined I shouldn't grow up untaught, like Dove and Dusty. She wanted me to do something. That's why you work so hard? That's why. Mrs. Lapham promised your grandpa would take me on just as soon as she was buried. She died, and he did. That's all." "What was her name? And how come she, a poor sewing woman, was so well learned?" "Round about here she called herself just Mrs. Tremain, but she was born Lavinia Leete. She came of gentle folk." "Just like Mr. Leete's daughter?" "Yes. She told me once that for over 100 years the Leetes favored Jonathan and Lavinia names." "Johnny, didn't she ever go to those rich relatives and say, 'Here I am'?" "No, and she told me not to, ever, unless only if I got to the end of everything. She'd say, 'Johnny, if there is not one thing left for you, and you have no trade and no health, and God himself has turned away his face from you, then you go to Merchant Leete, and show him your cup, and tell him your mother told you, before she died, that you are akin to him. He will know the kinship,' she said, 'and in pity he may help you.'" "Your cup?" "She said I wasn't to sell it, ever. I was to go hungry and cold first." "Where is your cup?" "In my sea chest in the attic. That's why I keep it locked." "Will you show me your cup?" "If you swear by your hope of heaven and your fear of hell never to mention any of this to anyone, never tell my true name, nor that I have a cup." "But Azana, if she's heard anything, she'll think it was a story I made up, like those rubies and the fruitcake." Now it was close to morning. Far off a cock crew. Near by another answered. The dawn breeze came up from off the sea, and the black night turned gray. Scylla was shivering and stood up. Johnny shouldered Azana. He kept his word to Scylla, and as he was putting the little girl back to bed, he slipped to the attic, unlocked his chest, and brought down the cup in a flannel bag his mother had made. He opened the door from the shop to the wharf. Although still dark inside the house, outside it was growing lighter and lighter. Gulls flew in from the islands looking for food. Scylla joined him, and he motioned her to follow him into the twilight of the new day. He drew his cup from its bag. As a small child, he had thought it was the most beautiful thing in the world. It was the reason why he had begged his mother to apprentice him to a silversmith, and there were none in Townsend, Maine. Now he was more critical of the cup. He thought it was too chunky. On one side was engraved the crest of the Leetes. It was an eye rising from the sea. From it rays of light or lashes streamed out, half covering the surface of the cup. It was this emblem Merchant Leete had on everything he owned, carved above his counting house on the long wharf, engraved on all of his silver, even on dog collars and harnesses. Miss Lavinia had it stamped on her Spanish leather gloves. Johnny knew it was cut on the slate gravestones of the Leet family on Copp's Hill. The same as his, said Scylla in wonder. And the same motto, look. She read the words in her halting manner. Let there be light. Oh, light. And miraculously, as she stumbled over these words, there was light. For the sun came out of the sea. The children stood and looked at each other. The girl's face showed her excitement and her fatigue. It was a pointed, sweet little face, her eyes a lighter brown than Azana's, and her hair not so strikingly pale. Johnny whispered, just like the sun coming up yonder, out of the sea, pushing the rays of light ahead of it. Scylla, evidently thinking Johnny was getting beyond himself, said, might it not just as well being a setting eye? It was the first sour remark she had made to him all the night. No, my mother said it is a rising eye, but I was to keep whist and mum about it, unless even God had turned away his face. And Scylla, you promised. By my hope of heaven and my fear of hell.